journalism. So it's going to be an interesting panel. We have several excellent panelists. Starting over here, we have Brian Furlow. He's a former New Mexico Independent and Rio Grande Sun reporter who does work for science and medical journals. He's supposedly a big fan of records requests and the cool things they dig up according to his bio. Colleen Hill here is a longtime Albuquerque Journal reporter and frequent user of records requests, sorry.
A frequent user, yeah.
Be clear about that. But to start things off, we have Sarah Welch, a former reporter and current director of the New Mexico Foundation for Open Government, an organization that if you do not know about, you should. She's a longtime expert in records law. She's going to start off this with a presentation, 20-30 minutes, kind of an overview of public records laws, and then we will have a bit of a panel discussion, and then we will take your questions. So, thanks for being here. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. I hope you guys had your coffee. I'm going to turn off the lights so you can see this. Is that all right? And I called this investigative reporting partly because I think that's what I called it last year, and also because it's a lot sexier sounding than records law. Nobody wants to hear about records law at 9:30 in the morning. So, but you know, that's really what we're talking about. Investigative reporting is totally dependent on records. And I just wanted to put this up there because I had this above my desk when I was a reporter up at the Rio Grande Sun in Espanola, and this is what I want all journalists to think whenever you get a press release. Press releases are not news, typically. It's advertising. So we're going to talk today about how you can dig up the news that somebody somewhere wants to suppress. And I think of it as a kind of a three-legged stool. You've got your sources, you go to meetings, and you've got records. And all of these things kind of feed into each other. Your sources can tell you what records you need to look at. Records will give you new ideas for sources. And then meetings kind of is where it happens in real time. So I'm going to talk a little bit first, before I go into kind of the nitty-gritty of how to get records, I'm going to talk about what records can do for your reporting. Documents are your friends as a reporter. So I'm going to go through a few of the things that they can help, how they help you. Documents can verify or debunk what your sources tell you. And this is the joke that I was told when I started at the Sun. How do you know your sources are lying to you? Does anybody know?
Lips are moving?
Their lips are moving, yeah, you guys know this. So, you know, if you just write down what your sources say, you're a stenographer, not a reporter. So you need to verify what they're telling you. The second thing, and this was a big help to me, particularly as a young reporter at a college, they can help you ask the tough questions. I'm not a confrontational person by nature, so sometimes it was difficult for me to walk into a mayor or a county commissioner's office and really nail them with that tough question. And it helped me to have a document that I could put in front of them and say, hey, you know, because then it's not coming from me, it's coming from the facts, right, or it's coming from the document. You can take that document to them and say, you know, this number here contradicts whatever you said in the meeting yesterday. I want to talk about that. They can lead you to new stories. Once you get on a beat, or if you're an investigative reporter, you're looking at a lot of documents all the time, and sometimes you'll notice things that are different, or things that are new, things you don't understand, and it can help you generate new story ideas. Teach you jargon. Jargon is a reporter's friend. Government uses an enormous amount of jargon, and if you don't understand it, then it's going to be difficult for you to explain what's happening to your readers. So documents, I think, can help you, can tip you off to what jargon you need to learn. They can protect your sources. Sometimes people can't go on the record. They want to tell you things, or they want you to find certain information, but it can't come from them. And they can tell you, you know what you need to do? You need to go get the minutes from this meeting, and then you need to go look at the budget and compare them. So and then you can report that according to public records, this is the case. And they can make your day. Reporting, investigative reporting in particular, is extremely fun. It's really fun to dig up information. It's such a great feeling to have that document that they don't want you to have, right? And that you got because of a records law. So these guys, I think, will tell you about some of the records they've gotten that have really made their day. One more quick point. I just want to talk about questions that can point you to documents when you're doing interviews, when you're talking to sources. Make sure you're always thinking about what documents you might dig up that will verify your story or help flesh out your story. So ask people why. Why do you do it that way? Why does it take so long? How do you know that is a big one. People will assert all kinds of things that they want you to print in a newspaper or broadcast on TV, and you need to ask them, how do you know what you're telling me? And, you know, just bluntly, is that in writing somewhere? Is there somewhere I can look at that? Okay, so as Peter said, the takeaway is that you have the right to see public records. Every record in a government building is by default public record that you can ask for. And if they want to withhold it, the burden is on them to justify and to point to the law that says they can withhold it. Right? It's your government, it's your taxpayer dollars that created all of that paper. And so you have a right to see it. And I'll come back to this at the end. But this is what I always tell people when they call me and they say, I asked for a record and they said no. Ask them why. Make sure you get that denial in writing. And ask them for chapter and verse. What law says I can't have this? It's not good enough to just say, I don't want you to have it, or we've never given that out before, which is a typical response. All right, so let's talk about nuts and bolts. How do you do this? So this is the law that we use, the New Mexico Inspection of Public Records Act. This applies to state level on down. So state and local governments, you're talking about the university, you're talking about the city, the county, any special taxing districts that you might encounter. And this is what the law says, that all persons are entitled to the greatest possible information regarding the affairs of government. And that not only that, but providing you with that information is part of their job. You're not asking them to do you a special favor, you're not asking them to go out of their way to help you, it's part of their job to provide you with information.
Is there a website where we can go to find things like this, these laws and stuff?
Yeah, all the laws are online, and then on my website I have the entire Inspection of Public Records Act excerpted. And I also brought some compliance guides. I would encourage you to have them in your newsroom, and I printed out the newest version of the law because there's been some changes since the last compliance guide.
Is this basically the same for the United States government as well as New Mexico?
It's not. The federal government uses the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. We call this IPRA, Inspection of Public Records Act. Federal level is FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. And I don't talk about that a lot because not that many journalists use it because it takes a really long time to get documents. Bryant is your man if you want to talk about FOIA. Bryant uses FOIA a lot. And it is a much more complicated and Byzantine process. That's why I like IPRA. IPRA for state and local governments is simple, it's straightforward. I'm not a lawyer, but I can read IPRA and interpret it on my own pretty much because it's very straightforward. So yeah, so this is kind of limited to state and local. So what is a record? Under the law, it's all of these things: documents, letters, books, maps, tapes, and it says regardless of physical form or characteristics. They had enough forethought to think, you know, in the future documents are going to look differently. So they didn't have to put in that emails are public records. They didn't have to put in that text messages are public records. They said everything that contains information regardless of its form. And then they wanted to make it really broad in terms of where are these going to live. So it's really anything used, created, received, maintained, or held by or on behalf of any public body and relating to public business. So if a jail is run by a private contractor on behalf of the government, its records are still public. It doesn't even have to be in a government building. If it's a government document, it's a public document. And I always remind people that emails are public records. You can ask for them.
A question on this is going to come up in my county about emails and also text messages that are held on personal accounts of public officials, intertwined with their clearly personal documents. It happens quite a bit that in local small towns and things like that where I work, they operate on Hotmail and things like that. Instead of the government-run computers, they might not be using a government-owned computer when they're sending these emails. They might not even be using a government email address, but they still are conducting public business that way. Where's the line?
So there's an Attorney General determination letter from 2009 which said that the mayor, when the mayor uses his Yahoo account to discuss public business, it's still a public record. Because the record is created on behalf of a public body in his capacity as the mayor, and it relates to public business. So it would be up to the custodian of records to, and this is where it gets tricky.
Retrieve and redact?
To retrieve, well, to ask for any records that relate to public business, and they have to turn them over. And what's happened in some other jurisdictions is typically there'll be a huge lawsuit over this exact issue, and then policymakers will go in and write a law that says you have to do public business on a public account so that we can access it. And that hasn't happened in New Mexico yet, but it's happened in other places.
So then if the governor flashes an email using government property that is not related to government business, is it still accessible?
Probably not, because of the relates to public business. If she's emailing her husband saying, you know, can you let the dogs out? I'm really, you know, I'm not going to be home late. Unless you can make an argument that it relates to public business, it's probably not.
Actually, the Sarah Palin emails out of Alaska are loaded with that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Those weren't redacted.
Yeah, and you know, they could release them if they want to. I'm just saying that in a court fight you might not be able to get that kind of stuff. And there is actually a court fight brewing against the AG for some emails related to their volunteer work. So some examples of public records. Job applications. There's a special loophole for you guys for university presidents. But below the president, people who apply for faculty positions or department heads or any kind of administrative job, you can look at the applications of the people who applied. You can look at the applications for people who are currently employed. Competitive bids and requests for proposals. This is one of those jargony things as a reporter. You get to find out about procurement. And you get to learn all about the difference between bids and requests for proposals. But basically, people want to build something or provide a service to the government. And they submit bids on how much they think they can do it for. I can build the building for $2 million, or I can build the building for $3 million. You can look at all those things around procurement. Surveillance footage. This is coming up. I don't know if you've seen the stories about the tape at the Roundhouse of Cheryl Williams Stapleton and Nora Espinosa getting into a little mix-up. But I just put in a request for that last week because we want to see the surveillance footage from the meeting room. Emails, as I always stress, and just a lot of other documents that you might want to look at. Yeah?
Oh, when requesting police dash cams or bell tapes, if they start an investigation, do you have to wait until the investigation is over to make a request?
You do not, and I'm going to talk about police records briefly. How to ask. It's a pretty simple process. There's no form that you have to fill out. I get that question a lot. You just want to locate who is the records custodian, and the government really decides who it wants its records custodian to be. They could just have one records custodian for the entire university, or they could designate one for a department or for the medical school. It's really up to them. So you need to find out who that person is. Send them a letter or an email. Ask to inspect records. I just think that's a good idea. Instead of asking for copies up front, because you don't know how many copies it might be. Include your name, address, and phone number so they can contact you. That's in the law. Include your organization's name. This is kind of an optional one. We didn't have clarity in the law on this before, so I encourage people to do it. But it's really up to you. If you want to say you're from the Daily Lobo and you think that'll help, include that information. If you don't want them to know that you're from the Daily Lobo, you don't have to say that. Identify the records you want. And this is kind of an important and overlooked point, that when you are putting in a request for public records, it's not question time. You're not asking them, you have a right to ask questions in an interview, but in a records request, you really want to stay focused on what documents are you asking for. If you start to get into asking them for specific information, or you're trying to answer a question in your records request, they might get confused about what you really want. So keep it focused on the documents that you need. And now, as of 2011, you can ask for electronic copies of electronic documents, and they're required to produce them in that form, in the format that they exist at the time of the request. These deadlines start tolling on the day that the custodian of records receives your request. So if you send her your request on a Monday, start counting on Tuesday. That's day 1. And then day 2 is Wednesday. Third business day is Thursday by 5 p.m. that day. If they haven't already provided the records, they should send you some kind of status update. So if they can provide them immediately, that's what the law says, immediately or as soon as practicable. If it's sitting on their desk, they should just hand it to you. If they can't do that, then on the 3rd business day, they need to give you a status update, like I said. And then 15 calendar days is kind of the outside deadline. They need to do one of these 3 things. They need to provide the records that you asked for, or they need to issue a denial in writing with an explanation of why they can't produce the records, or why they won't produce them. Or they need to notify you that you requested way too many records and it's going to take us a long time to produce them. So we can talk about some strategies for dealing with any of those things. If then everything goes well and they produce the records that you asked for, then you get into copies. If you don't want to pay for copies, bring your digital camera or a portable scanner. A lot of newsrooms are doing this now because it's cheaper. You don't have to pay for copies. They can't charge you if you're going to make your own copies. Look for their posted copy fees. They should have a notice in the office that tells you how much copies are supposed to cost. And the standard is that it should be their actual cost of copying. So the actual cost of making paper copies, maximum, the most they can charge is $1 a page. And then the actual cost of downloading it to a disk, actual cost of emailing or faxing you emailing you an electronic record or faxing you paper documents. And no charge if you make your own. I call what usually happens the negotiation dance. You put in your request and it doesn't go so smoothly. You don't get immediately to the copy phase. You get a request back, but you get a response back from them that you don't understand, or they say we have some of those documents but not others, or some of them are exempt. I always tell people, be reasonable, keep those lines of communication open, get to know your records custodians, and learn how to work with them. Some of the things you can do if maybe you went on a fishing expedition, maybe you put in a big request and you weren't sure what you were looking for, and they come back and they say, it's broad or burdensome, it's going to take us, 2 months to pull that stuff. Well, keep negotiating with them. You can tell them, well, I really need the records from the last 6 months first. Let me look at those, and then we can talk about going back in time further. And provide more information if necessary. Be as specific as you can about what you need, because it doesn't do you any favors if they give you, 10 boxes worth of documents, and now you have to look through them. So sometimes it helps you if you can narrow your request down to what you're actually looking for. And remember, sometimes you want to keep your cards close to your chest. Sometimes, just tell them what you're looking for. It's your right to have it. They can't deny it because you're a reporter and you're going to write a story on it. So sometimes, you can just be upfront with them about what you need. So let's go through some specific records. Are there some things you can't get? Yes, absolutely, but it never hurts to ask. The law places the burden on them to explain to you whether you can or can't have it. So let's talk about personnel records. In general, they're going to withhold medical records and matters of opinion in a personnel file. So that generally extends to letters of reference and performance evaluations. But you can see a lot, even in a personnel file. You can see salaries, you can see applications, including the person's resume that they used when they applied. Different agencies have different names for these, but basically a personnel action form documents any change in the person's status. When they were hired, when they're fired, if they're put on leave, that sort of information is public. And it's public for anybody that's a public employee. There's no, privacy interest for somebody who has a low-level job. They're getting public dollars, so their information is just as public as the president of the university. Let's talk about, did you have a question?
Yeah, quick question, sort of specific, but 911 calls are typically considered public, but what if they talk about something medical on the 911 call, about somebody, bleeding out or something like that? Is that protected?
911 calls are generally, part of the public record. So there's some issues with dispatch logs and for ambulance calls. They could probably redact it and get away with it.
Okay.
So police records, and this is true of campus police just as much as APD. So this is kind of the basic, this is the basic course of an investigation, right? Something happens, there's an incident. Let's say a student is assaulted. Police arrive on the scene and they take a report. They document what witnesses said, they document a little bit of what the scene looks like. That's sort of the original incident. And then they launch into the second phase, their investigation. They're going to look at surveillance tapes, they might gather fingerprints, they're going to interview a lot of different people and try to figure out what happened. And then they come out and they might arrest a suspect and charge him with CSV. So how does that relate to records? Well, this is kind of how I think about the records. That initial incident is part of the public record. When they respond to a scene, they're going to create a lot of public records. They're going to have 911 tapes, they have dispatch records, and that original report that they take at the scene is part of the public record. Right? We don't have secret police. We have a right to know what the police get called out to and what they see when they get there. Okay, then you move into the investigative phase, and they're producing a lot of investigative reports. These are partially public. They should release something, but they may be some fairly substantial redactions of any confidential sources that they're relying on, confidential police methods about how they process a scene, and information that is only known to the suspect or the perpetrator. They don't want to let everybody know that they have a certain piece of evidence from the scene because they want to be able to use that information when they're interrogating suspects. Then they come back out. If you remember, the final stage is kind of the public court process, the charging and the prosecution of the crime, and that becomes public again. They come back out into public, they book the person in jail, they indict them, they file a criminal complaint with formal charges, and then they go through the prosecution in court, and that's all public. We have public courts. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is there a certain time frame when police agencies should have criminal complaints completed? I mean, by law, though, is there anything like that requires them to do it?
If there is, then they don't follow it, right? I mean, this process, as you know, can take a few days or it can take years. But if you look at the exemption for law enforcement records in IPRA, it doesn't talk about whether the investigation is open or closed. So saying that the investigation is still open and we haven't charged anybody yet is not a reason to withhold anything. The only thing that they can really withhold is this confidential sources, methods, and information. And that can be withheld regardless of the status of the investigation. The status of the investigation is really irrelevant.
How does this apply to campus police or campus security?
Same. Yeah. Yeah, they're relying on the same law enforcement exemption as any other police agency in the state. There is a particular thing that you should be aware of as college journalists, the Clery Act, and this has gotten a lot of attention lately. This is a federal law. It's got a lot of attention lately because of the Penn State scandal. This mandates crime and safety reporting for all colleges and universities to participate in financial aid, which is pretty much all of them. This was named for a student who was murdered in her dorm room in Lehigh, and it did not become public for a long length of time. So they passed this law to force colleges to be upfront about what was happening on their campuses. So by October 1st of every year, they have to publish an annual campus security report. And this is helpful for journalists. Campus police have to maintain a daily log of all crimes reported to them. They should make the last 60 days available immediately, and then anything older than that they need to turn over within 2 business days, which is a shorter time frame than you have under IPRA. And campuses with dorms have to keep a fire log and publish their safety report. And those logs should go back, I think it was 7 years. They should keep it. And then all of that information should also be rolled into that annual report every year. So that's really helpful for you, and that's meant to keep colleges accountable, because colleges, as you can imagine, love to pretend that their campuses are really safe and that nothing is happening.
So there's been a lot of controversy lately surrounding these reports, and universities really underreporting all of the crime on the reports because they want their statistics to seem better in terms of how safe of a campus they are. So if you get the report and you can just tell, or you suspect that it's probably been underreported, how would you go about proving that with other public records?
That's a good question.
It's a good story.
Yeah.
You'll know anecdotally plenty of things if they're not in that report. That's a great lead for a
But I think the
story.
report, isn't it just like the number of instances? It's just like a rundown of...
Well, and there are some issues. I mean, that's your story right there, you know? There are some issues about how different crimes are defined, you know, what counts as an assault, what counts as a rape. So, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Depending on, I don't know that this is the case, but there may be a log that you could check at the police department or at the right division. But look for the source data that they're using to compile the reports you suspect are false and go through the individual records would be my advice.
Yeah, and I think that's the purpose of the log, so that you can compare what their annual report says against day-to-day what was being reported. And it'd be interesting to know if they're putting that log into any sort of database, or are they just writing it out by hand.
Most folks these days are doing spreadsheets.
You would think, and that makes it easier to crunch that data.
So do they have to write, in terms of the annual report, do they have to put down every crime that was reported to them?
There's some, I mean, yeah, it should be statistics. It should be the aggregate of that daily log. And I can send you some stuff more specific about the Clery Act. They, as you can imagine, the federal government has lots of regulations around this, around how this has to be done. But, you know, suffice it to say that on October 1st of every year, you should be able to get that.
And does the main idea of this apply to high schools?
No, this is colleges and universities. Yeah, because
But
typically,
in general, in a high school, you could probably ask, what are the crimes committed in the last 3 months?
yeah, I mean, typically, and I think one of the reasons for this is that a lot of college campuses have their own police force.
Yeah.
So typically at a high school, you would have the city or county law enforcement responding, and so anything that the police respond to is clearly public. I think there were some special issues with campus security forces.
Same with the high school stuff. If your high school does have surveillance footage, etc., do these laws about public records apply there too?
Sure.
So you can request surveillance footage,
Sure.
etc. Okay.
Yeah, anything that I say here about public records applies to school districts,
Okay.
public school districts. So private schools no, but if you're in a public school district, absolutely. So education records and FERPA, the Federal Educational Right to Privacy Act. You guys are going to run into this a lot whenever you get into educational issues. Right? This is a federal law, and basically it applies to you because the federal government can revoke some of its money if schools don't comply with FERPA. So this is kind of just to give you a general idea. You know, and I always say, if you're not sure, ask. If you're not sure, put in a records request and see what they say. But you can get a lot of information even under FERPA. You can get statistical information about educational performance. You can get education records if they redact student names. Disciplinary records, this is kind of a little loophole, disciplinary records if the student is extremely dangerous to others. Personnel action forms and incident reports, as we've talked about. You're probably not going to get any educational records with the students' names in them. And you're probably not going to get teacher performance evaluations and disciplinary allegations. Yeah.
So we've had an issue on our campus where they have been in security reports redacting the names of teachers and staff in any incident reports and citing FERPA for that? Are they're wrong, right?
I would think so, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, FERPA applies to students.
Students only, okay.
Yeah, it's educational records. And it's ironic there's been a lot of talk about FERPA lately because the original purpose of FERPA was to make sure that students could get their own educational records. So it's kind of got this dual purpose where they want people to be able to get their own educational records, but they don't want everybody else to get them. So then down at the bottom you can see I put, should you ask for it? Absolutely. If you're not sure, always ask and see what they say. All right, real quick, dealing with denials, step 1. So if you put in a public record request and you don't get what you thought you were going to get, what do? Number 1, make sure you get the denial in writing. The law requires them to give an explanation. And to me, that means a pretty detailed explanation of what statute they're relying on, what exemption they think applies to these records. And try to get the name, this is in the law, just remind people, get the name and title of the person who's issuing the denial. If it's a lot of times it's a lawyer, and you need to know who am I dealing with, who do I need to talk to about this. Consult your IPRA compliance guide. like I said, the Attorney General puts out, publishes these Inspection of Public Records Act compliance guides. I have a very dog-eared copy of one in my office, and I had one next to my desk as a reporter that I looked at almost every day. So I brought a few of these to put in your newsroom with the latest version of the law printed there. And that's actually, it seems like a big book. When I stopped being a reporter and I took this job, I actually read it cover to cover, which I had never done. And there's a lot of really helpful stuff in there that I had never found before. There's a lot of little nuances in the law. There's a lot of little tricks that you might not know, even if you use it a lot. So if you're really bored one day and you want to read the whole thing cover to cover, I encourage it. But you know, like I said, I'm not a lawyer, but this guide is there. The law is really straightforward. I say just read it and see what you think. Respond to them in writing. At this point, when you're dealing with a denial, you know, before you get to the denial, there's a lot that you can do verbally to kind of negotiate with them and work with them. At the point at which they issue denial, I think you should start putting everything in writing. You know, just so that you have documentation of what went back and forth, and so you don't get into a he said, she said sort of thing. And then always go up the chain. If you're dealing with a records custodian, if you're dealing with a lawyer and you think they're being unreasonable, go up. Go to their boss, go to a department head, go to the regents, and say, you know, your staff is withholding this information from the Daily Lobo. Is this really the policy you want to pursue of withholding this information from the public? And sometimes public officials who have to be elected are much more forthcoming than a lawyer might be. Sometimes not, but it never hurts to try. If none of that works and you still are getting nowhere, you call FOG. There's our numbers. I'll put them up again at the end. Publish a story about it. That's one of the superpowers that you guys have, that you can write a story about it and you can embarrass them. If they're violating the law or if they're being overly secretive, call them out. People don't like to hear that their government is withholding information from them. And then you can also send a complaint to the Attorney General Civil Division. There's the information, and it's on their website, nmag.gov. That has limited utility. It's useful for people down the road because when you finally do get a determination that other people can use it, but it's probably not going to help you in time for your story, to be honest.
Oh, go back, please.
Oh.
I can't write that fast. Just a second, please. All right, for me, if you want to go.
Okay. So back to, you know, the takeaway, which is that you should assume that any government records are available for your inspection. And you should ask for them, and it's up to them to tell you why you can't have it. And if you do get a denial, please ask why. Get it in writing, and try to get them to cite chapter and verse for you. And that's it. I'm going to turn it over to Bryant and Colleen, who can tell you lots of war stories about how this works in the real world.
And I did want to ask you too, maybe to start out, I was going to ask a question, but Sarah just made an excellent turn of phrase out of it. Is there a document from your careers that you've requested that totally made your day? And could you tell us about that?
For me, it happens maybe once a week or so.
You have a good life.
Wow.
Yeah. Although, you know, the bar's kind of raised after a while. I mean, I've been doing this I'm Colleen Heald. I've been with the Journal for 26 years. You could see by my desk that I deal a lot with public records. I'm overflowing onto a neighboring empty desk with records.
We could put that kind of in the center there. Get everybody.
The one thing that's happened to me in recent years is that I deal a lot with state government, and they all have public information officers these days. You can't talk to a real official that knows something most often. They want everything in writing. And the answers you get, you have no idea how many people were involved in writing them, and usually they don't tell you much. That's why filing a records request can cut through all that, most of the time, and talk about war stories. In 2009, actually it was Kate Nash from the New Mexican who's organized this event today. She had written a story in the Santa Fe New Mexican about an illegal billboard that House Speaker Ben Lujan owned up north of Santa Fe. And I read that story and thought, well, I'll ask the speaker about it. And at that time, thank goodness, I think he was healthy, he was fine. But he told me no comment. And I called the Department of Transportation, and they had very little to say. So I filed a records request. And I would say after the 14 days, I was just about to get the records, and I got a call from somebody I didn't know to my direct line at work. And he said, "You don't know me, but they're not going to give you all the documents that you're entitled to. They're withholding documents from you that are public because they're going to show that the Department of Transportation is actually making deals to try to get this billboard legalized." Now, they didn't say that to Kate Nash in her story. They made it appear in that story that they were being tough and were telling the speaker he had to get the billboard down. So here I get this call, and that's never happened before. And I was supposed to pick up the records the next day. And I went in to the public information person, and he said, "Here are the records." And I said, "Did you withhold anything?" Meaning, for any reason under IPRA. And he shook his head and looked down and said, no. I wish I'd had a camera that day because he looked so guilty. He said, no, that's all there is. So we came back and it had been sanitized. Luckily, the person that called me had made copies of what they had taken out. And that was a really honest government employee who probably should, he might have gotten fired. This was during the Richardson administration. He might have gotten fired if they'd have known he was talking to me. So we had the records that supposedly they had removed. And as Sarah mentioned, the best way to deal with some of these issues is to write a story about it. So, so right before the story ran, I called the PIO and I said, "Why didn't you give me all the records?" And he said, "I did." And I said, "Well, we understand there's a number of them that you didn't." And he said, "Well, if I didn't, I meant to tell you that we were withholding them for attorney-client privilege." And I said, "Oh, really? Why didn't you put it in writing?" So we ran a story quoting him and quoting the records that they withheld that really made them look pretty bad. 2 weeks later, the same thing happened again with the same public information officer on a different story, but still involved the State Department of Transportation. And I got another call saying, they aren't going to give you everything you want. They're going to give you what makes them look good, but they're going to be embarrassed if the other records become public. So we went through the same kind of conversation again, and within days, the Albuquerque Journal sued the State Department of Transportation. And talk about war stories, that lawsuit lasted up until, well, 2 years. It lasted 2 years and was only settled after the new administration of Susana Martinez came in. Richardson administration fought it tooth and nail. And they even deposed me to ask me questions about how I knew what I knew, which was no fun, but we ended up winning. And I still to this day wonder if we had if the Richardson administration had still been in office, we might have gone to court with it. They were fighting very hard. We still have another lawsuit against them that names me as a plaintiff, but that is due to personnel records. And I think, did FOG join that? Personnel records of the 59 employees that...
No.
Yeah, so we still have that pending, but, so that was really interesting. It wasn't a record that I didn't get officially, but I got unofficially, and that was very
Can I add 2 quick things to that story?
Sure.
One is that you left out that the Journal got $150,000 in attorney's fees, which is
true.
what helps those lawsuits keep going.
True.
And you would think would hurt the state a lot, and encourage them not to do that again. The other thing is that there was a great opinion and order in that case. The judge said, basically, if I accepted the DOT's argument, it would be an absurd result where they could just release 1 document and withhold 100 and not ever tell you. So I actually sent that to somebody yesterday to help with that.
Yeah, they claimed it was all inadvertent, that it was a big mistake. First of all, that they didn't tell me that there had been records withheld, but on the other lawsuit, they said that there were just 2 piles that I was supposed to get, and somebody forgot to pick up the other pile.
And I think it was, for those of you who were maybe here last year, I think the editor of the Journal was here and announced that. So
we were very happy. I did not want to have to go to court and have to testify. I only like asking questions. I'm not crazy about answering them.
That is no fun question.
Colleen, can I ask, what was the billboard argument?
The billboard was illegal because the speaker didn't get the correct permits, so it was going to have to come down and he wasn't going to be compensated. But they were trying to find ways behind the scenes to make that billboard legal by designating it a certain kind of zone, or, the billboard did come down. And they condemned the property, and the speaker is still fighting that in court.
Question?
You said earlier that you were deposed about how you knew what you knew. In New Mexico law, are we protected under press privilege? Are our sources protected under press privilege?
To a certain degree. They, right off the bat, said, we don't want to get into your sources. They didn't want to fight that battle, but they went around the edges, asking me questions like, well, how often do you request records? How many times do you not get them? And, things that I just thought were kind of related to my news gathering techniques, but I had to answer those. But no, they didn't demand to know my source. But I was very concerned about that.
Brian, have you ever gotten a document that made your day?
Yeah, like Colleen, it happens frequently. The one that it was not a document, it was 1,500 pages of documents that I'm primarily a medical writer, and so I use the Federal Freedom of Information Act on a weekly basis, as well as various states' IPRA laws that Sarah described. And I've been lucky to work at institutions and news outlets that have FOIA and IPRA in their DNA. I worked with Sarah at the Rio Grande Sun in Espanola, and I write for a medical journal called The Lancet Oncology, which got its start in the 1800s as a muckraking progressive movement expose kind of medical journal. And they stayed somewhat true to those roots by they hired people like me to do investigations of health agencies at the federal level and so forth. In the early 2000s, I was sent out to central Nevada to a little town called Fallon to cover a medical mystery. 16 children out there had been diagnosed with childhood leukemia inside of a couple of years. It was thousands of times higher than the expected rate for this rare disease. And it was right next to the Navy's Top Gun Air Base. And there were various chemical exposures that were known that I won't go into, but at one point the Navy assured the community that they had done a check of their own medical records and had found that they don't have higher rates of childhood leukemia Navy-wide, and they felt that that exonerated the Navy from any possible involvement in what was happening in this little ranching town. So I FOIA'd them for all of their FOIA-related documents, and I got back a no such documents claim. They said, we have nothing related to the Fallon leukemia cluster at the Navy medicine offices at the Pentagon. And so I wanted to encourage you guys to always question a no such records response, because when I wrote back to them and implied that I not only knew about some of the documents, but that I had some of the documents, their response was to send me a box with 1,500 pages of responsive documents. They were heavily redacted, but they explained in a cover letter that during their initial search, these documents had been overlooked in a file drawer that hadn't been properly marked. But once they thought, right, it's the unmarked drawer. So Sarah mentioned that records can speak for your sources. If there's a source you won't go on record, they may well be willing to tell you what documents can speak for them. If they're willing to, ask them where the documents are kept. Ask them what file drawer they're kept in what office, if you can. If you're protecting your source, you may want to be a little circumspect, but it's helpful to go into an office knowing exactly where documents exist. Just call their bluff immediately. Say, no, it's in the third drawer down right there. That's what I'm after, fourth file back. That will sometimes shake people up enough that they will just disclose it to you. I've had that happen at the PRC a few times. I wanted to make a few other quick points. It's important that you anticipate and preempt delay games. I've had state agencies where I'll ask for emails and then they come back and disclose the emails but not the attachments. So now I say, I want any and all emails and any and all attachments that go with those emails. I want to encourage you guys to think about who all should have a document and hit up all of the agencies. If it's an important document and there's an agency that produced it that may have more to lose by disclosing it than one of the agencies that was CC'd on an email or something, ask the agency that produced it, but ask the agencies also who should have received a copy of that document. Just a couple of weeks ago I had a situation where a state agency denied having emails I wound up obtaining from another agency that had been CC'd on those emails. And the issue was brought up of what to do if you doubt official reports. When I was at the Sun, there were some budget cuts at the local hospital. Presbyterian runs the local hospital up there, and they cut their EMS budget, which meant that they could only staff 2 of their 3 ambulances. And we wanted to take a look at whether this was delaying response times to emergencies, because they only had 2 buses to cover all of Rio Grande County, which is the size of Connecticut. And the 911 dispatch center was not being cooperative or helpful, and they were fighting us every inch of the way. So I ended up going to the bunkhouse where the ambulance drivers at the hospital actually sleep and wait for calls when they're on call. And I said, do you guys keep a copy of your ambulance dispatch times and your arrival times? And they said, of course we do. It's right there on my clipboard. And so for several months, first thing I would do every morning is go by the ambulance bunkhouse and check the clipboard and write down ambulance response times. And we were able to document that indeed the average time of response for ambulances getting to emergencies had been slowed pretty significantly. Don't blindly trust your documents. I just learned this again working with ME on a school embezzlement case in Vaughan, New Mexico. Documents are written by the same people who will lie to your face. They're a heuristic, they're a tool, but you can't just assume that what they say is true. I went to ME with what I thought was a great scoop. It was an Office of Inspector General's report from the State Education Department.
It still was a great scoop.
Thanks. I think I oversold it though, and ME cautioned me that it was, there must be a reason that the scoop was, the report said that this woman had likely embezzled much, much more money than she had admitted to, and there were reasons that they believed that. But when she was indicted, she was only indicted on $10,000 worth of the embezzlements. And ME encouraged me to find out, why the discrepancy. And it turns out that the prosecutors were right, that most of the money that the investigators thought had been missing, in fact, was only missing because the woman who did the embezzlements also kept very sloppy records. And it took a lot of people a lot of years to get everything in order and find out exactly how much of the money had gone missing. So this is my byline in the communicator. which I'm very proud of. It's a heck of a paper. I was just telling Emmy, they do some amazing photography in this paper.
And what's that mean?
I'm sorry, Emmy is this gentleman behind you, Emmy Springelmeyer, the editor of the Guadalupe County Communicator.
So the moral of the story is if you're going to embezzle a lot of money, you should keep good
Be
records.
messy, yeah. Okay. Be messy. When I was covering Rio Arriba County, the procurement officer for the county was infamous for keeping sloppy records, but he knew where everything was. So he would reach for something if he wanted to give it to you, but it would frequently be, I'd ask him about the Health Commons, a county building that was going up to provide a home for healthcare services. And he would be reaching into a ChimIO file for a building that's a community center. But he knew that everything was in the wrong place, and if he wanted to help you out, you would notice that he was always reaching in the wrong file for those things. The last thing I wanted to point out to you guys is that it's important as you start to get comfortable with your beat that you look for what's missing. I've gotten more stories from spotting what's missing than I have from sources, deep throat sources or leaked documents. And if we have time, are we out of time? I'm just going to run through a couple of examples.
We have some time, yeah.
I'm just going to give you some quick case studies to illustrate what I'm talking about. I noticed in 2010 that the Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Bureau had not included its annual report on the AG's website like the rest of its bureaus had. So I FOIA'd it. And usually annual reports are platitudinous and dry and not all that interesting. But this one revealed that Governor Richardson's Department of Health and some other agencies under his control were stonewalling investigators, AG investigators that were looking into allegations of Medicaid fraud, big cases of Medicaid fraud around the state. So that led to a series in the Independent, the New Mexico Independent online. And when I was at the Independent, we also noticed that the state PRC's insurance division, the folks who oversee the state's insurance industry, had not issued a press release celebrating that they had completed their annual 5-year accreditation inspection by the National Insurance Commissioners Association. And that seemed odd because it was a softball they could throw out that they had been reaccredited. So we IPRA'd those documents, the accreditor's field inspection report to the PRC. And it turns out there was a good reason that they hadn't wanted to draw attention to it, because the NAIC inspection report was absolutely scathing. It lamented the divisions, and this is a quote, woefully underqualified staff and lax oversight of the state insurance industry. That's why they didn't be included. And then that led to a big rigmarole about who had leaked me this document, which was hilarious because nobody had leaked me the document. I'd gone in with an IPRA request and somebody had honored it. But they had assumed that everyone would know that they shouldn't disclose something like that to me and assumed they had been leaked. When I IPRA'd the town of Bernalillo's drinking water quality lab reports, I found out there weren't any. And the town's contract engineer, I learned, had been telling town officials, had been assuring them that the labs were good and that his new multi-million-dollar arsenic filtration system was working just well. But that he kept forgetting to bring his lab reports to council meetings. So because of what Sarah mentioned about contractors who are doing public work and being paid with public dollars are subject to IPRA, I was able to go to that contract engineer and demand the lab reports that he had been hiding from the council. And lo and behold, they showed that this multi-million-dollar system was not working, and it was in fact dumping a lot of aluminum sludge into people's drinking water. So, and then a subsequent IPRA to the State Environment Department, trying to figure out how they had not caught some of these problems, revealed that the state discovered that the town had been operating this new water system illegally without state approval. So at the end of the day, the town fired the engineer and they halted a $9 million expansion of his newfangled system to other water systems. And I have one more. I write for the Lancet Oncology. I'm really proud of that association. The Lancet is in the 1800s was a lamp that surgeons would use when they were working on folks. And it was a muckraking journal. It was a progressive medical journal in the 1800s that did things like put an end to baby farming in England. And it was the first journal, the Lancet, to take on the tobacco industry in the mid-20th century. I did a story for them that started with my just asking the California Cancer Registry in 2007 for memos that deal with this curious delay I had noticed in the release of new cancer data. Most states released annual cancer reports where they tell you, here are our statistics updated for the most recent data. And what I got in return for that IPRA request was a report describing the fact that the U.S. Veterans Administration in 2005, 2 years earlier, had halted its reporting of veterans' cancer data to all states in the United States. And this had created an artificial drop in prostate cancer rates nationwide. The reason California wasn't releasing the data is because the registrar was a person of integrity who didn't want to mislead the public and make it look like prostate cancers were going down, when in fact it was just that the VA wasn't reporting their cases. The reason it was important, and the reason the journal gave me a couple of pages to report it, was that this was the same set of state cancer databases that the VA at that very time was using to meet its congressionally mandated obligation to track Gulf War veterans' cancer rates through time. So they were depending on state cancer registries to track their veterans' cancer rates, even though all of the VA hospitals had stopped reporting newly diagnosed veteran cancers to those same databases. And the New York Times actually followed up on this story in 2007. So I just wanted to throw those out there. One other thing I'd like to tip you guys on is that it's an election year. And so you're likely going to have some big shot politicians come into campus. Last time around, I don't think anybody caught it, but you should take a look at who's reimbursing the university police for their time providing extra security for those visits. The university shouldn't be eating those costs. The campaign should be reimbursing for security costs. And I belatedly learned that's something that didn't happen last time around. Bill Richardson apparently, allegedly, had promised the Clinton and the Obama campaigns that the state would take care of it, and didn't.
Sarah?
Yeah, just hearing Bryant talk, it made me think of something that, you know, we talk about maybe where to start looking for documents. We talk so much that journalists have this oversight role, right? And the fourth estate, the press has this important role in government oversight. But, you know, you're just one person. You can't oversee all of government on your own. And I think a common thread in Bryant's stories is that there are a lot of built-in oversight mechanisms that already exist. There are inspector general offices, there's congressional oversight or legislative oversight, there's accreditation agencies. You know, there are a lot of different entities that are doing oversight work. And so a lot of your stories kind of started with looking at a report of one agency looking at another agency's performance, and that so that I think can be kind of not a shortcut, but a useful kind of starting place.
We have about 15 minutes left, and I would be happy to ask them questions for that 15 minutes, but your questions are much more important. So if this is your opportunity right now, if you want to ask one or two. Yes.
It's kind of complicated. So last year, there was the employee salary book that the journal played a huge role in getting actually released. And then like a week later, the university then pulled all the graduate student instructor information. And then they cited FERPA as the reason, because even though graduate students are now teaching more than 40% of the undergraduate classes on campus, they're considered students, and therefore all of their information is protected. So we went up the chain, and we talked to Bingaman, and we asked Bingaman to make an appeal to the education board at the US level, and they said, well, there's this political implication that if we see graduate students as employees, then they might be able to unionize across the country, and that would cost us a bunch of money. Right? So what would you do next?
That is not a records question, that's a political question.
Doesn't your instinct say that information should be public? That they're
My
doing
instinct
work?
says everything should be public, but that's not always the case. Yeah, and I think they do have a case under FERPA, actually, unfortunately, that information is.
They only have an opinion on FERPA, but it came from a guy who worked for the higher ed under Bush. So anyway, you're right. I'm sorry. I just wish that could be public information.
And you know, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and Student Press Law Center have a lot of great FERPA resources. And they like to point out that nobody's ever actually lost funding because of FERPA, that it's a toothless law. Yeah. But, you know, I'm not going to encourage them to violate privacy law.
Does this get into a point, though, that one of the tools, besides having a good paper trail that you generate in your negotiations with whatever government entity, it really is nice to have a good attorney? how can we access a good attorney though? It's like, what if you're working for some paper out in Hobbs or something like that? Are all paper, if you're the journal, you can sue them, but can all papers really do that?
No, they can't, and that's one of the purposes that FOG serves, is that we have a lot of volunteer attorneys that work with us, and we can't always sue. We actually rarely can sue because we don't have the resources either. But we can provide information and advice about the next step, and our attorneys can look at things and give their input. The great thing about IPRA and most state records laws is that there's fee shifting, which means if you sue and you win, you get all your money back and then some. So this is what enables a lot of people, you know, and small papers do struggle to have some of those upfront costs paid. But if you win, you can get your attorney's fees and costs and sometimes some damages back.
And sometimes I imagine all that's needed is a nice letter from some attorney.
From an attorney, right. And some attorneys, you know, some public interest attorneys will take it on a contingency basis where they'll do the work on the assumption that they'll get paid at the end.
There's a question back here. Yes.
Oh, yes. This campus has been transitioning towards private student housing. And with that, it's been impossible to obtain any incident report requests or even just get onto the property and talk to people. Oftentimes we're bullied out of there, told by security to leave. We're told that we have to talk to corporate spokespeople, but you know, those individuals are in Maryland, and so it's
they never get back to us.
And they never get back to us. So what's the way that we can get around that, especially since the university within the next 5 years is going to be completely private run student housing?
Sorry, I just took a big bite. The university records custodian is still responsible for those records. They're being held on behalf of the university, so the buck stops with the university records custodian. And I would just point out, you know, make your case for why these are still public records, and they are. And that the university records custodian, if they're not in his or her physical custody, needs to procure them and produce them for inspection.
But what's happening is that these private companies are not even contacting campus police, they're keeping it internal, and so the records custodian says there is no record of anything that's taking place, even though there's so much to the contrary.
Yeah, like how does the records custodian then get it from like a private corporation, because that's what they're considered?
It's their contractor. They have to provide it to their employer, which is the university. Those services are being provided on behalf of the university.
Within the contract, the company is allowed to handle its any issue on its property internally. Essentially, it is its property. The university only leased it to this company.
But aren't the records still public records?
Yeah.
But if there aren't any records because the company decided not to make a record, then
yeah, just
well, and this gets into, you know, another issue of you can't IPA records that don't exist, and then the story becomes, why do the records not exist?
Yeah.
You know, and are they violating any other law, or are they violating the contract by not reporting things that are happening?
So then the contract itself is a public record.
Correct.
So then they can go to the record custodian and say, I would like to see the contract between the company and the university, please.
Oh, absolutely. And it sounds like you have the contract.
yeah, we
Yeah.
have contracted. We've had it for a while, and that's
Yeah.
kind of a stopgap where we're at. Is that this company is basically not making a record because for them it's a PR battle, and if it comes to be known that that there's 20 minor possession reports in a single night over a weekend, it makes their image look bad, and it makes their this safe campus that they're trying to build
Right.
worse.
So what do administrators in the region say about all this?
Well, for them, it's a money. I mean, for them, they're building construction on campus. They're making this campus even better. It's a very clean image on the surface.
But you're right. But that's
And
what I'm saying. Are they
care.
okay with
Yeah.
what's happening? That these aren't being recorded?
Well, yeah. I mean, and if there isn't a record,
well, they
they're not
approved this
gonna-
whole project for
Yeah.
ACC to come in and do all of this.
And if there's not a record that shows that there actually are these incidents taking place, then they're not going to comment. They don't speculate.
Right. But you can, yeah. But you can go back to them certainly and ask them directly. This is what we're finding. Is
Yeah,
this
we have.
okay?
Well,
yeah.
I have.
And they're okay.
No, they don't speculate at all. They ask me for proof, and I can't be like, well, come with me on a Saturday, let's go party.
What are the federal reporting requirements for the university to report crimes in housing? Could this university be violating those reporting?
And you'd have to look at what the Clery Act says, because there are some.
But is this company even under the Clery Act because it's privately owned?
Well, I mean, if the university is using a contractor to operate student housing, you know, that shouldn't matter. It's still the university's responsibility.
And they take, and I mean, aid pays for the ACC stuff, so.
Financial aid?
Yeah. Just that, how big is yeah.
I mean, essentially, the bottom line is that governments can't skirt records law or accountability laws by farming out work to contractors. They are still maintaining, you know, ultimate responsibility for what happens.
Could I ask you guys about the difference between getting records in small towns and small papers or media outlets and big towns like Albuquerque, where it seems you have a much more professionalized approach to obtaining records. You have PIOs, you have records custodians who have actually done this before. But my first job out of college was an old little paper in rural Oregon, and it seemed that part of my job was to go out and actually inform these people as to what the law said. So given that these students, a lot of them will have a first journalism job in a small town in the middle of nowhere, what kind of tips would you have for them about dealing with this, how it should work versus how it actually does work in really small towns?
Okay, my background is I worked in big city papers, I worked in DC, I worked in places like that, and then I brought myself to a small town. So I'm in a small town in Guadalupe County, Santa Rosa, and you have to play a much more constant game of triage when deciding when to push the legal button and file a request, and when to wave the law over your head and whip them with it, but without going to a formal request. In our case, we have some agencies that their understanding of the Inspection of Public Records Act is, oh, you're going to make a public records request? That means we have 15 minutes to, or 15 days to delay. And I've talked to Sarah about this before. It's we have to constantly educate them. So what I've learned is it works at all levels. You have to know when to use a formal request and when the threat of a formal request is probably better than an actual request. And a good example on a day-to-day basis, every week I get all the police reports of incidents and arrests that happen. Well, we've got one agency that has the most reports and gives out the fewest details about it. They want to give me a cover sheet redacting names of victims and redacting names of juvenile suspects and redacting other information that I could fight them on and get unredacted. Well, I could file a formal request or go through a big process on that, but it's actually better to figure out that there are multiple agencies that touch each of those reports and each of those suspects. So while educating the one law enforcement agency about what the law entitles me to, I also developed another threat of a public records request to get much more than I would ever get from a different agency that transports the suspect. So if someone was arrested for, you name it, a spousal abuse kind of case, rather than fighting to get more information from the police department, I go straight to the sheriff's department, which transports the person, and they've been trained to provide more information. If on every case, whether it's a procurement issue, if on every one that I had to go through a formal letter and the formal process, it would be infeasible for us with as few resources we have. So I have to pick my battles on those. But yeah, when you're in a small, when you don't have a team of lawyers, and you don't even have as much time as you have as a specialist at a metro paper, you have to pick the battles, and you have to know when, okay, this is the only way to get it, and this is the only way we're going to get a volume of information. Use the the formal request for that. But otherwise, work your back doors, work your sources, use the threat of a formal process, and then gradually over time train those agencies about what the law is. That's still a battle that I have. And I still have to educate them about what the 3-day means, what the 15-day means. But you can find ways around it with just the threat of invoking the rights.
Well, and it reminds me when I was getting ready to leave the Sun, the fire chief said, he said, "You did a good job, Sarah. You know when to stroke them and when to choke them." And that's exactly what and, you know, for me, one thing is the deadlines. I think people will take the law as seriously as you make them. And that's how you train them. Put the deadlines on your calendar. When you put in a request, put the 3-day deadline and the 15-day deadline on your calendar. And make sure that on that 3rd day and on that 15th day, you're contacting them and saying, "This is the 3rd business day after you receive my request. What's the status? I need something in writing." And on the 15th day, say, "You need to give me the documents or a written denial." If you hold them to those deadlines, you're going to teach them the law.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this panel. Thank you very much to our panelists here.